So I've been working on deliberative mini-publics, which for about 20 years now, and on citizens' assemblies for about 5 years. When we think about democracy, we spend so much time thinking about elections and thinking about what our political representatives do, that we forget that democracy is about everyday people engaging. So what excites me is these new ways of doing democracy, these new ways of bringing citizens into the decisions that affect their everyday lives. And that's what gets me going. So too often climate politics is seen as something for experts and is something that seems a long way from everyday citizens. And so we think we should put that to one side from democratic politics. But it's all about democratic politics. It's about how we're going to live in a warming world, and how our children are going to live in a warming world, and the children after that. And so it's a real danger that we just think this is about technology. This is about our changing lives. So we need to be in that discussion. There are a number of reasons why our democratic system isn't good at dealing with climate. The first is that those people who are most affected aren't here. Future generations aren't present to make their case. Secondly, politicians are really affected by the electoral cycle. They've got elections every 3, 4, 5 years, and they need to deliver things in that time. Climate politics and dealing with climate requires us to dealing with long-term issues, and that's really hard. Thirdly, we've got the problem of established interests. Lots of established interest groups do very well out of the current system and actually blocking change. And so for all of those reasons, and there are other reasons as well, we actually need to reinvigorate democracy to deal with the climate. And I think there are a number of ways we need to do this. One is we need much more diversity of voices. One of the problems is the political elite and have a very limited perspective on what the future may look like. Whereas actually, if we bring diverse voices in, they can bring in the voices of different views about the future. It isn't just about the technological elite, it isn't just about the political elite, it's actually bringing in everyday people. I think we make a real mistake if, when we're thinking about the future, we haven't got a broad range of views on the table. So one of the reasons I'm really interested about deliberative mini-publics, about citizens' assemblies, is they bring that diversity of people together. And then what they do, which is really important, is they give them time to reflect, time to learn, time to think, time to work collectively to think about what we need to do together. And that's really rare. That diversity and that time and that sort of deliberation and that deliberative moment is really rare in our politics. But it's those sorts of conditions that allow people to think long term. Two concerns from politicians, I think. One is, can citizens do this? And the second is, if they can, are they taking my role? On the first issue, can they do it? I think the evidence we have is yes. So we've been running these sorts of deliberative processes for over 50 years, and now with citizens' assemblies over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's very clear that citizens can grasp both the technological aspects and, most importantly, the ethical and moral aspects of those issues. They don't become technical specialists, but neither do politicians. They hear evidence from technical specialists, they hear evidence from interest groups in the same way that politicians do. The difference, though, is that you've got a diversity of perspectives. You've got this kind of very diverse community of everyday people who are hearing that, which means you have lots and lots of different perspectives on the issue, lots of different types of everyday experience which people bring to bear. So the kinds of judgments you get out of this are, if you like, public wisdom. It's the everyday wisdom of people. So this is a very different sort of input into the political process. And I think that's where that is really valuable, because we're always hearing from different interest groups who have got a drum to bang, a particular interest to push. Whereas this is a group of everyday citizens who are sort of just trying to grapple with the issue. What's best for us? Now, for politicians, that can be a challenge. So there's two ways of thinking that, very often politicians say, well, we were elected by the citizens, clearly we can do this. And I think there are two issues again there. One is that the politicians come from a particular social background, that they understand these issues from a particular perspective. And that can mean that they don't necessarily understand the diversity of views. And secondly, when they do hear about these views, they hear about them from particular interests. And I think this kind of input, which is what is it that everyday citizens think about these issues when they're given time to consider them, is such a rare thing within politics, such a rare input into politics. And so I don't see it as a challenge to politicians who are willing to say, I want to understand and hear that perspective. I think the danger is from politicians who say, I don't want to hear that perspective, that actually this perspective isn't important, because that suggests to me a certain arrogance. That suggests to me a limited understanding of the way that we could do politics. So this word deliberation is often misunderstood, and some people think deliberation is debate, but debate is very often one side shouting and the other side responding and not listening to each other, whereas deliberation is about hearing the other side, listening to the other side, trying to appreciate the reasons why people are saying things and trying to come towards a collective agreement. And that is really critical in democracy. So one of the ways that we can compare is with what we used to is a traditional political debate, where one side and the other side are arguing with each other but not really listening. They're just putting their points out there. And this is becoming much more the way that politics is realised because of polarisation. So people are not listening to each other, they're shouting and not listening. Deliberation is about weighing ideas, it's listening to the other perspective and trying to understand the reasons why they say what they say and trying to come to sort of collective understanding, trying to reach collective agreement about what to do together. And I think that idea of deliberation is really critical to a civic culture. And I think having a culture of deliberation is really important for future democracy. So citizens' assemblies are really important because they're a space which we've designed in order that we can have very carefully managed deliberation about really difficult topics, but actually it's something we need to see spread through society. We actually need a culture of deliberation about the way that we engage with each other across difference. There are so many differences within society, and we can deal with that in different ways. One is we can polarise and go and be in our own communities and shout at other people, or we can celebrate that difference and learn across it and actually develop a better culture of democracy. So there's a tendency with climate politics and with sustainability more generally that there's a feeling that we just got to get the right solution and then we can solve the climate crisis, we can ensure sustainability. But these are ongoing issues. We'll never actually completely achieve sustainability. We'll never solve the climate crisis. We have to live in a warming world. So we've got to develop a politics that's ongoing. We will face lots of crises. And so we can't think that that this is a one-off technical solution. It's actually about developing a democratic culture that's able to respond to those crises. And if we don't respond to those crises, we undermine democracy. So it's really important. Democracy and dealing with the climate, dealing with the pandemic, those sorts of dealing with the crisis we're facing in security at the moment are not one-off things. They're actually a constant way of doing politics and being politics. And that's really why we're sort of putting this focus on trying to build deliberation, because that's going to be the solid foundation in which we deal with the multiple crises we're going to face. So climate assembly is a relatively recent phenomenon. We've been doing deliberative engagement for about 50 years, but on climate specifically around mitigation and adaptation really only recently. And what's been fascinating is the rise of national level climate assemblies. So we've now had 9 national climate assemblies across Europe. And that's a real change in practice, because usually this has been local or regional. And the evidence we've got, again, is when you put citizens in this space, they are not only willing to talk about climate and learn about climate and make recommendations, they are absolutely able, they have the capacity to do it. And the kinds of reports and recommendations they produced are always pushing the boundaries of what governments are doing. And that's really wonderful to see that actually citizens, when they're faced with these issues, actually say, no, we need to move further. We need to move faster, and we have really creative ideas on how we could act. The challenge is for governments to actually do that. But I was going to say, there are examples already of change. There is no question that in Ireland and in France, they have much more robust climate law than they would have done without climate assemblies. There's no question that in France they now have a much more vociferous and much more robust public debate about climate politics because of the convention that they ran. Now politicians can't avoid talking about the climate because it's in public consciousness, and that's very much because of the citizens' assembly that was held there. In the UK, my own country, we have what's called the Committee on Climate Change, which is an independent body which has to produce climate budgets each year in order to see what the government is doing, to weigh what the government is doing. They're using the evidence from the UK Climate Assembly to structure their budget. So to say, okay, what would it take to do what the Climate Assembly is suggesting? So there are ways in which climate assemblies are becoming really important elements of climate governance. So in my own country, we've been running a lot of climate assemblies. Some of them, if I'm honest, have not been well organised, and that's a real problem. Others have been really effective. So there was a local one in a small town in the northwest called Kendal, which has really revitalised climate activity within that town, where I think the town council actually lacked imagination, but the citizens showed them what they could do. There's an example in Oxford where there's been massive investment in climate policy because of the proposals put forward by the Climate Assembly. So they can really shift thinking. So where an authority it doesn't know what to do, or is deadlocked, or doesn't believe that citizens are interested in this area, they can really be inspirational. They can really change the decision-making culture. One of the most exciting developments is in Poland, and there mayors agree to implement the decisions from the Climate Assembly if they receive more than 80% support amongst members. This is really radical. This is really changing the dynamic. These birds are beautiful. And there's an example in Poland where in Gdansk they did an assembly on flooding, and there is no question that the measures that were put in place because of the assembly have really protected the city in a way that the previous proposals would not have done. So we often run these assemblies because we realise there's a problem within public authorities. There's something dysfunctional within the system. So we've not been able to make a decision on this, or there are debates about whether or not we should move forward in this area, and that's why we run an assembly. So we create this assembly and we have this fantastic deliberative process, but of course then it goes back into the dysfunctional system. And if we haven't worked on that system, if we haven't engaged with the public officials, if we haven't prepared that public authority to receive that Assembly's recommendations, then it's not a surprise that sometimes these things aren't implemented, these things aren't responded to well. Where we need to put most of our work, I think, is now on public authorities, is working with them to be ready to receive the recommendations from the Assembly. We spend lots of our money and lots of our time on the public engagement bit, and it's really important, but we need to spend as much energy working with public authorities being ready to receive the recommendations. And one of the problems here is sometimes a public official, the first time they know about an assembly is when they receive a recommendation. And not a surprise they're a bit resistant. Who are these people? What right do they have to tell me what to do in my job? So we really need to have those people engaged early in the process. And I think much more of our work needs to be done on working with public officials in order to help them to integrate this work. And what's really important, I think, is we don't just think about the deliberative process, we also think about the follow-up. So it's really important that when a climate assembly is commissioned, when a mandate is given by a public authority, that they commit at the start to say what they're going to do in response. That, for example, they, at minimum, a few months later, they provide a recommendation. That they explain to the citizens how this is going to be used in the policy process. This doesn't mean that they will follow everything to the letter. It doesn't mean necessarily they will implement everything, although in Poland they do. But, it's completely understandable that there may be good reasons why a public authority doesn't implement the proposals from a climate assembly. But they have to give a reason. They have to justify it. It mustn't sit on a shelf somewhere. It mustn't be forgotten, because people have given up so much time, so much energy. It's a democratic crime to then ignore that. One area where we've got to be really much more creative is how we link these citizens' assemblies, these climate assemblies, with just broader public debates. These amazing assemblies happen, and yet most people don't know about them. And we've got to find out ways of feeding them. Partly this is an issue about communications and about media. The media likes confrontation. The media likes polarisation. And yet this is a process in which people try to understand each other, try to work creatively together. That doesn't sell newspapers, but actually it should. We need a new media model here in order to sort of bring the deliberations of climate assemblies into the broader deliberations of society. And that's really, really important. That's something where we need to do much, much more work. We need to integrate these processes with other engagement processes. And I always like the Scottish example where, while the Assembly was running, they also ran deliberations within schools and within their youth parliament. And when they produced their recommendations, their report, they not only put the Climate Assembly recommendations, they also put the youth recommendations. And I love what happened in Estonia with actually having just an assembly which was a youth assembly to bring in views about the green transition in one area of Estonia. I mean, that was a real innovation in climate assembly practice. So in many ways, citizens' assemblies are how we would want to see politics being done just generally, which is, you know, hearing the evidence from different perspectives, hearing it from different experts, hearing it from different stakeholder groups, and then having this chance to deliberate together across difference, you know, with lots of diverse views in the room. And in many ways, we'd hope that would be how parliaments would work. But, you know, people get caught up in party politics. People get caught up with interest groups, etc. And the great thing about deliberative mini-publics and about citizens' assemblies is they create a safe space, a secure space for that to happen. It's very carefully designed. It would be great if all of politics was like that all of the time, but actually we know that it isn't. That's why we have to create these these one-off assemblies. But they shouldn't be one-off. They can be made permanent, and there are a number of cities around the world, a number of areas around the world that are starting to do that. Not on climate change in particular. We've got the Paris Assembly, which is permanent. We've got one in East Belgium, which is permanent. But there's also a couple of cities in Europe that are starting to design permanent climate assemblies. And I think that's the exciting bit, that they aren't just these one-off moments, that actually they become a permanent part of our democratic culture, of our climate governance.
Yeah. Anyway, that was fun.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.